Our show is about bringing the best practices in education to inspire, connect, and empower all educators by providing practical tips that can be used in the everyday school setting.
Welcome to Coach Me If You Can. I am your host, Kristie Wurglitz. I have Stacy Colgan here with me today as well. And today we're going to speak with our guest star, Danielle Pink. I am an NSSEO district coach and my background is in teaching special education.
And I am Stacy Colgan, the professional learning coordinator at NSSEO, and my background is social work.
Danielle Pink is an international author of several fascinating books. Some of my favorites are Drive, When, and A Whole New Mind. Danielle's books contain content around business, work, creativity, and behavior.
Not only is he an author, but he was also a co-executive producer of the television show Crowd Control, which is a series about human behavior, which is on the National Geographic Channel, which aired in more than 100 countries and has appeared frequently on ABC, PBS, CNN, and other TV and radio stations in the U.S. and abroad.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for joining us on the Coach Me If You Can podcast. We can't express enough how excited we are that you're joining us today. Do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to be an author?
A little bit about myself. My favorite topic, as a matter of fact. So I grew up in Central Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio. I was, and I think it's relevant to a group of educators, I was actually a pretty good student in elementary and high school, largely because I was very dutiful and compliant. I wasn't particularly smart or creative, but I was dutiful and compliant. And I went to college. I majored in linguistics in college. I then went to law school because I was a middle-class kid from middle of America, and I was worried that I would never have a job. I ended up not really liking law school very much and deciding that I wanted to pursue what was then my true interest, which was politics. So I worked in politics for a while in a really kind of bizarre way, became a political speechwriter, did that for a while. But then at about the age of 30 something, early 30s, discovered that what I really wanted to do when I grew up was become a writer. So I write my own stuff, which I'd been doing on the side for a long time, basically my whole life, but never really considered as my profession. And so I quit my job. My wife did not quit her job or give up her health insurance. And that was about 20 years ago. And I've been trying to write my own stuff, make sense of the world, of work, of business, of behavior, of the human condition as best I could in just finished my 7th book.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to say, taking that writing to the next level, you certainly have. So the way I was introduced to your work was probably about 5 years ago. My boss asked me just a simple question of, Stacy, what part of the day would be the best for you and I to get together and work on a project? And I was like, I don't know. She's like, well, when are you on? And I was like, I don't know. She's like, I have a book for you. It's called When.
What an enlightened boss.
Right? Oh, shout out to Christine Igo, the most amazing boss out there. Yes, yes, yes. I can't say enough good things. She was always introducing different books like your book, When. As you hear, I am a huge fan of that book. And my team, like Kristie, knows that I am also very addicted to time. Time is one of my 3 values. So your book is one that I've gone back to over and over again. I would love for you to tell us, I want to know, what made you write this book? Or how did you decide that this was something that you needed to get out into the world?
As you guys can see, I'm talking to you from my office. My office is just a refurbished garage behind my house. We live in Washington, D.C. It's in a fairly urban neighborhood. So we're a 5-person family, but 1 car park on the street. And so the garage becomes a place where I work. And I say that because for years, what would happen is that I would come to this office. I would ask myself the kind of decisions that Christine was asking you. And I was like, oh, okay, say, I'm writing. Should I write now or should I wait till later? Should I do this phone call now? Or should I do it later? Should I take a break now? Should I do it at a different time? And I was really making these decisions in a very, very, very sloppy way. I was just making it up. And I thought there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I started looking around for guidance, thinking, okay, someone has cracked the code on this. And this is what really surprised me is that the guidance didn't exist. And then I was like, that's kind of weird. And I wonder if there's any research on this. And because the last several books that I've written have taken, looks at large bodies of mostly social science and say, what can we extract from that to work a little smarter? And as I wonder if there's any research on this question of timing. And it turned out there was a huge amount of research on this question of timing. It was all over the place. It was in something like 20 something different disciplines. And I came to the conclusion, and this is actually the answer to your question, that if I wanted to read this book about timing that I needed, I would have to write it. So this is a book that I wrote because I wanted to read it. If someone else had written this book, there's no way I would have done it. It's very, very hard. It was a very, very hard book to write, but I learned a huge amount from it.
Yeah. Okay. So are you a lark, a third bird, or an owl? Night owl.
I am. Okay. So for your millions of listeners who might not know what this is, so there is a concept in a field called chronobiology called our chronotype. And that's just our propensity. Do we wake up early and go to sleep early? Do we wake up late and go to sleep late? It's a mostly biological, heritable quality of people. It changes over time, over our age. But in general, so about 15% of us are very strong morning people, larks. About 20% of us are very strong evening people, owls. And about 2/3 of us are in the middle with kind of leaning toward larkiness. And that's totally where I am. I am the most common kind of chronotype, which is not a full-fledged lark, but larky. I'm not one of these crazy
I like that.
I'm not one of these crazy people who wakes up I shouldn't say crazy people. I'm not one of these people who bounds out of bed at 5 a.m. and goes for a 6-mile run and then reads 3 newspapers in 6 languages before having coffee at 7:30 and being at their desk at 7:30. That's not me. But I'm also not one of these people who rolls into the office at 11 o'clock in the morning and then is beavering away at my desk at 11 at night. That's not me either.
Okay, well, I loved the information and learned a lot from it. And now as a supervisor and having a team, it's something I also ask my team. And I'm glad. I asked Kristie, and then her and I read the book together. So that's kind of how this started.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So thanks for answering that. I have to tell you, though, the advice I won't take from you, though, that is in the book is the waiting 90 minutes or 2 hours to take your first cup of coffee. I just can't do it. I've tried. Can't do it.
Too hard.
I know. I have to say, though, I have the same issue. And the times when I do it, I'm glad I did it. There is a material difference. But that's a hard one for me. And that's one area where my wife had a very similar reaction to that set of ideas. She's like, this is great. It's really interesting. I can use it, but there's no way I'm following that one.
Yeah.
It's definitely a hard one.
It is. Thank you for writing that book. Now we'll go on to read the next one.
All right. So another one of your books that we really loved was Drive. And I love how you talk about the difference between engagement and compliance. And really when we think about bringing that into the education world, you talk about instead of bribing students with compliance, we want to challenge them with engagement. We want to bring in more of that autonomy. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between compliance and engagement and what that would look like within a school?
Yeah, great point. And I think it's really, really important. I think it's super important in school. I think it's super important everywhere, but I think it's doubly important in schools for at least 2 reasons. One, engaged learners learn more than compliant learners, period, full stop. The second is that schools are where people learn habits, learn the way the world works. And if schools are focused too much on compliance, which I think many of them are, then you put students into a difficult situation when they come out of school, in that in order to flourish, they have to not only figure out how to engage, but how to unlearn those habits of compliance. So I think the stakes are very high on this. So basically what compliance is doing something because an authority figure or a system is telling you to do it and to do it that way, and not have it actually be freely chosen, and not have it as part, and not even understanding the point of the exercise. You're just doing it because you're told to do it. And then engagement is actually being fully invested in what you're doing. Having some, not necessarily massive amounts of sovereignty, autonomy over what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, but when you're doing it, but also knowing why you're doing it, knowing how it fits in, and really fully endorsing it. And there's a big difference. And we see it a lot in the research in education about the different, and this is a really important point. I actually think educators understand this. I think that policymakers do not, and I think that parents do not, is the difference between learning goals and performance goals. Performance goal is getting a grade. A learning goal is mastering the material and the skills in a particular domain. And I have to say, you guys asked about my own, well, I gave you some information about my own education. I'm a walking example of this, of the difference between compliance and engagement, the difference between performance goals and learning goals. And I'm sort of embarrassed to admit this, but I will admit it because I think it's in the service of helping other people. So when I was in high school, like many high schools that in the early 1980s, we were fortunate that we had, they taught foreign language, non-English languages. They taught Spanish and French, as many schools in America did. And I took French for reasons that escape me. And so let me tell you about my experience in French class. I also took French in college, largely because I'd taken it in high school, right? So 4 years in high school, 2 years in college, straight A's in French. Straight A's. Every single term, A's in French. I can't speak French.
I was just going to say, how's your French?
Exactly. That's exactly the point. That's a great way to elicit people's understanding of this. Like, how's your French? My French stinks. All right. Why? Because I was after the performance goal. The performance goal was getting an A on this week's quiz, getting your homework done neatly, getting an A on the midterm, getting an A on the final. It was not, how do I use the French language to express myself when I'm in a French-speaking country? And people get faked out a little bit because they think that the performance goal is a reflection of learning. And that is not always true. In fact, in many cases, it's false. And so what we should be doing, and what I see now even more than when I was a student, if you look at many high schools, not all, because there's a lot of variance in high schools and things like that, but certain high schools, middle-class high schools, it's an obsession with performance goals, an obsession with it, and actually no concern at all about learning goals. And that's destructive, because what we know from the research is, and I try to tell my own kids this, is that if you pursue a performance goal, it's not inevitable that you're going to learn anything.
Right.
It really isn't. However, if you pursue a learning goal, chances are your performance is going to be fine. And so so what we have is a very long-winded answer to your simple question is that performance goals are largely about compliant behavior and learning goals are largely about engaged behavior.
So how do you think we can get our teachers to carry on with this and bring more of that engagement and focus more on learning goals?
I don't want to put all the onus on teachers. I think it's a system-wide problem. And I think you got to bring parents along. I think you have to make the case about, I think you have to ask people, how's your French? I think in some ways that's part of the answer. I think you have to actually begin. It's a long process. I don't think you can snap it and it's going to happen. I think you have to start telling people the difference between learning goals and performance goals. I think what we need to do is we need to have a reckoning in some ways with grades. What's the purpose of grades? I'm not against grades all across the board, but what's the purpose of grades? The purpose of grades is to give people feedback. And the purpose of feedback is to allow you to perform better. And when it comes to things, certainly certain domains in education, whether it's algebra or what we want kids to master algebra. What we want more than anything is we want kids to be able to think mathematically. And so that needs to be our goal. When we think about like English, we want kids to be able to express themselves in writing and to make arguments in writing and to be coherent and clear, right? That's the goal. Getting an A in English is not the goal.
Right.
The goal is that. In non-English languages, that's the case. In music, but the thing is, we do it in some ways in other realms, but we don't do it as much in the academic subject. We do it in some ways in sports and music. We don't give on the basketball court. We get feedback on how we're doing. We don't give somebody an A in basketball, or the person who is going to practice and playing games, and she's learning how to be a better basketball player and how to be a good teammate, not to get an A in basketball, but to get better at basketball and to be part of a team and to help the team succeed. But we don't bring that same kind of ethic in these other disciplines. And it's actually hurting the level of actual learning.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Okay, third and final book question.
Yes.
In your book, Whole New Mind, you talk about the right brain thinkers and how they're the future. Right brain thinkers have their own ideas, utilize creativity, and think outside the box. How can we encourage our teachers to redesign how and when their students learn in order to allow their students to be these free thinkers and prepare them more for the future?
Yeah. And I want to make clear there that this argument about the importance of these of thinking in big picture, design oriented, storytelling, symphonic, empathic thinking is it's a good in and of itself. It's also actually really urgent because these more reductive, quote unquote, left brain abilities, logical, linear, sequential abilities, they're still absolutely necessary. You have to have them, but they're not sufficient in the world of work anymore. And because they're easy to outsource and easy to automate. And so there's a new urgency on these kinds of things. The whole system has to get involved in this. So parents have to understand that. So what kind of people who are succeeding in your company, your organization, what are the thinking skills that they are using? What kind of thinking skills do you wish you had? And most people would say, in terms of their thinking skills, that most people would not say, oh, I wish I had gotten 20 points higher on the math SAT. They would say, oh, I wish I were better at relating to people. I wish I were better at coming up with new ideas. I wish I were better able at managing projects. I wish I were better able at putting all the pieces together. So I think it's about parents. I think it's about the curriculum and the people designing the curriculum, which in many cases are policymakers who don't know squat about education, but who are imposing requirements on school districts and on superintendents and unfortunately on teachers. So again, I just want to say that it's a system-wide thing. I think there are a few things that we can do here. And we've heard about these in education. More project-based learning, which again, everybody talks about it. Not many people do it very well, but your entire work life is projects. Mm-hmm. And how do you manage a project? How do you take a project from conception to delivery over a long time with all kinds of, I think that project-based learning done right is really important in fostering that. I think that in some cases, breaking the boundary between, sort of crossing the boundary at least, between what is school and what is the real world is really important. I think that's especially true for adolescents. Oh, yeah. One of the things that drives me nuts, or there are a lot of things that drive me nuts, but one of the things that drive me nuts is when people say high school students are not motivated. And then just to go back to something I said earlier, it's like, okay, really? Let me see that school play. Let me see that field hockey team or that volleyball team. And, so what is it that the school newspaper, what is it about those enterprises where kids are like diving in and doing it willingly, without grades? What about it? What do they do? What do they get out of that? I think what they get out of that is that it's freely chosen. No one is demanding that you work on the school newspaper or be on the volleyball team. It is with other people. And so your performance affects other people's performance and their performance affects yours, but you can do more with a group than often you can with yourself. And also the other thing, which I think is really important is that, and I saw this with my own kids and I see it with adolescents all over, is that it's real, right? There's a big difference. I had this experience as a student. There's a big difference between writing a paper for your English teacher and writing an article for your newspaper that's going out to everybody in your school or maybe even your community. Right. There's a big difference between shooting free throws in your gym class and playing basketball in front of a crowd on Friday night. And so I think all those kinds. So how can we make academic disciplines a little bit more like what we see with music and sports and theater and school newspapers, real, collaborative, freely chosen? I think that'll help out a lot. So I deeply believe that there should be two big requirements in American secondary education. And they seem to be at odds with each other, but I think that they are actually in sync with each other. One of them is data, statistics, and probability. We live in a world increasingly of data. And you have to be literate in that. I don't think every kid should be or wants to be a data scientist. I think that every kid needs to be literate in data thinking, in statistical thinking, in probabilistic thinking. You're going to be a better citizen that way. You're going to be a better contributor that way. I think it's fundamental. I also think that there should be a fine arts requirement in every secondary school, that you should have to take, and you should have your choice, musical performance, theatrical performance, studio art, something like that. Because I think that when we look at the skills that are necessary to the future, I think one of them is computation and the other is composition.
Yeah.
And together, people who are good at computation and at composition are the ones who are going to flourish and change the world. And we're not thinking, I think, broadly or boldly enough about education in that way. So if we have people who are computational thinkers and compositional thinkers, that's the whole mindedness that I think is going to be extraordinarily effective.
I see the next book.
I mean, it's basically daughter of, son of, whole new mind in a way.
Yeah.
But I've changed my view a little bit on that. I'm really convinced about the computational thinking and everything I do, everything we do at work, not everything, is a form of composition. In the way that a musical composer composes something, a way that a painter will compose something, a way that a playwright will compose something. What you're doing here, right? Think about what you're doing here with this podcast. You're coming together. You have a vision for what it's going to be, how the big pieces are going to fit. You're composing, right?
Right.
That's huge. And so computation and composition. And if you want to be alliterative, when I always do, I would add a third C, which would be compassion, because I think that we have a dearth of compassion especially in American society right now.
Thank you so much for all of your insights. Honestly, I'm having a really hard time choosing one of my favorites.
You don't have to. It's like your students and your children. It's like they're all my favorite, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think if I had to pick one, I think
okay,
my biggest...
you have a favorite child. Yeah.
Yes. If I had a favorite, I really loved the quote you said, engaged learners learn more than compliance learners. I love that. And just remembering to bring in that engagement and really focus on those learning goals.
Absolutely.
I think that was my favorite.
Yeah.
But again, very hard to choose.
Yeah. There's so, I mean, this was such a short time period and I felt like we put so much great information in. So thank you so much for taking the time to elaborate on our questions.
Well, you composed it, man. That's how it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. I appreciate how you started us off with, I love how you were doing the research and just asked the big question of when is the best time? How am I making these decisions? And from that, you wrote the book that was needed out there. So I appreciate that because from time to time, I think we in education see that. We think, okay, well, there's not a true answer to that. So where do we find it and how do we create it? So thank you for giving us a little bit of that nudge to be able to go out there and kind of do it ourselves and spearhead
there's
that.
There's an old line in academics where it's like all research is me-search.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
I like that.
Yes, I agree with that. Okay. So before we jump off here, just a couple more questions. What's something that empowers, inspires, or connects you?
Can I do each of those?
Sure. I love that. Yeah.
All right. So inspire. And this is not BS. Seriously, I would say it to a different group of people. Educators. People who have, I just think that the people who've chosen to devote their lives to educating our kids are heroes. And we don't revere them enough. That a big deficit of American society is that we don't revere our educators the way we often revere our first responders and our military, who deserve reverence. But educators should be on that pantheon. So educators inspire me because the more I know about the education system, the more I realize that they are working in a totally messed up system, but they show up every day, push the boulder up the mountain.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Empower. This is going to sound weird, but it really goes to my childhood, is that I've always found reading really empowering. I've always read a lot, even when I was a little kid. I think it's one reason why I've worn glasses almost my whole life, because I think I ruined my vision reading. I still, with all the stuff on social media and Netflix and streaming services and all that kind of stuff, I think there is no replacement for reading. And so when I read an interesting book, when I read an interesting long form magazine article, I feel empowered. Connected. is eating. I think that there is nothing. I find that I have the richest and best conversations with friends, with my family, with everybody when we are sitting down to a meal, not a fancy meal.
Yeah.
Could be a pizza. But I find that eating in together is a really powerful form of connection.
All right. So now we're moving on to the last portion of our podcast, which is our rapid fire questions.
Uh-oh.
So, rapid fire real quick. So just answer the very first thing that comes to your mind after each question.
There we go.
All right. What is something new you have recently learned?
This might be a little bit embarrassing, but I read a great story yesterday, the day that we're talking, about a woman who is a medical student at the University of Miami Medical School who is pushing back on certain anatomy terms because you basically had men naming women's body parts in a way that actually is quite misogynistic. So that a lot of like for instance, like fallopian tubes. Mm-hmm. It's from a guy, all right? As if he invented it. Yeah. So that's one thing. That's one thing I never thought about, where terms of anatomy came from. And they come from a very gendered, male-dominated place.
They come from Mr. Fallopian.
I mean, truly, like all these things. And it's like, wait a second, it's like, I'm sorry, like, you don't name that kind of stuff after a dude.
Yeah. Who was your favorite teacher growing up?
I had a teacher, high school journalism teacher named Peg Zadonis. And what I liked about her is that she really let me do my own thing. And she allowed me to use her classroom to do my own thing, even to the point where, like, I hated assemblies when I was a kid. And she would allow me, like, to sit in there was her classroom, and in the back was a newspaper room. So it was sort of a long classroom with, like, a regular classroom here, and then, like, a separate area that was, like, the newspaper room. And she would allow me she wouldn't say anything. I'd never ask permission. But it's just like, oh, God, they're having an assembly. I'm going to go back and sit in the newspaper room and do some other work. So that was my favorite teacher.
Oh, wow. Love that. Me too.
Shout out to you said Zadonis?
Zadonis. Yeah. Peg Zadonis.
Awesome.
Columbus, Ohio.
What book are you currently reading?
It's a long one. I like short books, but I'm reading a very, very long book.
Ooh, it looks like
See how long this is?
Wow.
Yeah. It's a biography of Andy Warhol.
Oh.
Who I think is an incredible innovator. And I wanted to hear, like, how he became so innovative. And this book is literally, it's 900 pages long.
Wow.
The pages are, like, really, really dense. Yeah. So it's really like, it's literally the length of, like, 3 or 4 books.
Yeah.
So
no kidding.
I'm like 1/3 through it. So I've read I've read a book. I just have 2 more books contained in this book.
Well, and our listeners obviously can't see, but as we're looking at you through Zoom, you have this beautiful background and bookcase of all of these books. How many books are back there? I mean, you got a lot.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, decent number of books.
Yeah.
Decent number of books. I love it.
Very cool. All right. Best advice you have for an educator?
Go for small wins. The system is messed up. You can't change everything. Get small wins. Small wins add up to small wins.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Love that. All right. So last and most importantly, how can our listeners find you if they want to learn more about different books you've written or just learn more about you?
That's an easy one. I didn't have to think about that one. So I have a website. It's www.danpink.com. There's a newsletter, all kinds of stuff there. Everything's free.
Awesome. We'll put that in our show notes too.
And what's your social media of choice?
I'm a little bit down on social media these days.
Okay.
I find myself not using it all that much. I find that this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I find that I learn a lot more just by reading.
Yeah.
By reading, like, books, by reading online or print magazines. And, I feel like a lot of the social media that I see out there is self-promotion, humble bragging, and, like, people screaming at each other. And I just don't, it's like, okay, it's like, I'm not really learning anything here. I'm not that entertained. So I'd rather reach into one of these piles of books here that I haven't read than doom scroll for half an hour.
I love it.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
It was such a pleasure. Just know how much you've impacted the two of us and so many others
Thanks
out there.
Thanks a lot, you guys. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Okay, so long, you guys.
Take care.
Join us next week for another exciting podcast on Coach Me If You Can.